one of the things that we talk a lot about is even if they're planning on being in the classroom, maybe at least 50% of their students in the fall, that if they design for this hybrid model, this co-modal or HyFlex model, they'll be ready to go fully online again in a much better way than they did in this last spring. And we were all kind of like forced online, whether we wanted to be there or not, students and faculty. And so by doing it better by designing that online experience, and then using it in a dual mode or even a trimodal situation in some situations, prepares you for going back to fully online. And then you can go fully online and do it a lot better because it's already kind of thought through. You've designed it that way as opposed to just, did whatever you could do just to get through the rest of the term.
Exactly. I was teaching with a comodal, right? La formation comodal that we call it on Université Laval. And my switching online was super easy, right? Because I already had my 3 groups. Like I already had my 3 modes. And students were alternating. So even those who were coming to campus, sometimes they chose to be online for whatever reason it was.
Exactly.
So for them, moving online wasn't this huge of it was not challenging for them to use the technology and be online and interact online because they were already used to do that. And even in my classrooms, I was making sure that the online guys were interacting with the offline. So in classrooms, we had these activities that were happening, on Adobe and on the different platforms online. So they were already engaged on these platforms. And this is why I invited you to, I wanted to discuss this with you because I felt that because, as you're saying, we had the design already there, whatever happens, we can move back and forth between the different modes and adapt to whatever situation we are in.
Yeah, we basically have resilience by design. We have the ability for instructional continuity, kind of almost no matter what happens. I mean, there are some situations where we probably couldn't teach if we weren't available, of course, but in general, we're in a much better place. And so if we can, my personal challenge at my own university is to work with them. They've been very resistant at administrative, even when I was part of the administration. The deans in particular, they did not want to feel like they would have loved to have this approach in their colleges, but they didn't have a relationship with their faculty that they felt they could push it onto faculty and say, we need to do this and here's why, without being able to support it with a lot of money essentially to kind of pay them for the course redesign that they'd have to do. Interestingly, in the spring, there was really almost no pushback from the faculty. Even we're a unionized faculty, so we have a union that tries to protect faculty from having to do work that we didn't sign up for. But there was really almost no noise from them either. Now for the fall, when they talk about us being fully online, now the union's getting involved and saying, hey, wait a minute, administration, you're basically requiring faculty to do work in the summer to build their online course versions that they're not on contract for. And so they have to have some sort of compensation for that. So that's the first kind of major pushback. It's interestingly, it's coming from the union, but I don't hear that at all from individual faculty members themselves. Most of the faculty members I know, they're designing their courses as they see fit to teach it online in the fall. And most of them weren't happy with their Zoom sessions overall. And so they're doing a lot of different things. But we've built in this 99% of our courses, probably 100, but not quite everyone is using the LMS in some way. And so that team, the team that supports the faculty using the LMS, is really working hard on faculty development, working with 700 or 800 faculty this summer in workshops to get them to learn how to use the LMS better to support the various functions of teaching, right? The content delivery and engagement and assessment and things like that. So I think we'll be in a pretty strong place. And be ready for in the spring when they want to bring back more students and open up the campus more. We're still going to need this idea of we have to be able to support online students as well, because not everybody's going to come back and they still want to be engaged. Not everybody who's here will want to come to class. And then if someone comes here and then they get sick in some way, they're going to be out for a couple of weeks. And so we have to be able to support that. So I think this is a thing that's actually going to bring HyFlex pretty broadly, even to San Francisco State, a very conservative teaching place.
You have the same approach here at Université Laval, where, as you're saying, during the summer, most faculty members, they have to to switch online. And most of them are not ready because they never taught online. It's not because they were like, they didn't have to teach online before, and now they have no choice but to teach online. And they went through the winter semester and they weren't satisfied with whatever they were. Like, they tried their best, but it was challenging to move quickly in a time of crisis. So we have all the support system that is being built. And as faculty members, we're also doing webinars to help other faculty members. So we're really creating this community of people who, whatever, I have my strength in this, I will share this with you. You can, so this exchange is happening. And we also have our edtech, so education technology students, who will be doing their stage, their, like internships, or just to support the faculty members during the summer. So as you're saying, they can't do it alone, and they have to have support. It's impossible to be able to redesign their courses to meet the demand and the needs of the students online, and be able to facilitate their courses. So this is another challenge, right? So, and when I started working again at Université Laval, it's new. I was teaching before at Concordia University, and when I went to Université Laval, and it was the first time that I discovered the formation comodale, so the HyFlex model, and my course was originally delivered online. So 100% online. And I decided to change it into HyFlex model, like simply because I was curious about that. And I was interested about, the challenge to be able to interact with people online and in class at the same time, and be able to, it was another challenge for me. I taught online, I taught in class, and that was, I was curious about it. And I was happy that actually I did that, because it came at this right point where the crisis happened and I had to switch online. But not every professor is ready to this is a challenge. And I talk about my experience. Many faculty members talk about workload. They talk about, as you mentioned in your book, you have so many different challenges that need to be addressed. Just thinking about the HyFlex. And the other thing, so I was curious about it, and I was also working on the digital transformation and how education is moving, right? And how it's being transformed. And I found that the HyFlex model really answers to this need of how to present and how to work and how to design the different learning experiences in this digital transformation era. So what were the discussion? Because for the COVID, this is, I believe it's a good solution, especially when we're coming back. But for the whole digital transformation thing, it's not, like I think there's a long-term transformation that is happening. And I think HyFlex design model is really relevant at this time.
Yeah, if you think of the way we live our lives, if you think of banking, I haven't been in a physical bank in a long time. I've been to the ATMs outside, but almost all my banking is done online. If my bank did not give me the option of doing things online, I would, there's no way I would be part of that thing. We're seeing even in the commerce, even our brick and mortar stores over the last couple of months, the ones who've stayed open they've had to have that online service component and either ship it to you, or now you can pick it up, or now we can actually start going into stores. But I think that they're going to see a continuing shift. A lot of the customers who came back to them online are going to stay online as long as it's available. So I think we're seeing this across, in almost every aspect of life that has anything to do with, some sort of technology mediation. And so the expectation, I think, is changing so that the students will demand this more. The faculty will have more experience in general, and will become part of what is like accepted as, okay, these are some baseline. We have to be flexible in the way we're serving our students, or they're going to go somewhere else. And as we continue to see competitiveness and the challenges with budgets we're going to see over the next year or two or three are going to help drive that from an administrator perspective, and hopefully down to the faculty perspective. So. Interestingly, our university was doing business continuity planning really the last few years for most units, but almost all the units in academic affairs had never really addressed it. It was all really on the business side of the university. How do we keep our systems running, et cetera, et cetera. This is the first time I think we've ever really had to deal with widespread instructional continuity challenges more than just like for a week or two, with a fire or something like that. And so I think finally, that kind of business continuity kind of mindset planning will be in the minds of our academic leaders, in particular the deans and their department chairs, to realize that we have to be able to continue to teach no matter the situation. As long as we can actually communicate, we should be able to continue to teach and serve different kinds of students in different ways and give them the flexibility so that we can better serve them. So yeah, I think this is like the perfect storm of opportunity for models like HyFlex to be out there, because I think gone are the days, and I think they were gone a long time, but most of us still operated like we could still say, okay, you want to be in my class, you have to be here, 12, 15 weeks, whatever it is, these times, do everything here. And then because one of the challenges I've seen with that always, students seem to have the feeling like, I'm out of class, I don't have to think about this. I've got class coming up, all right, take a half an hour, quickly scroll through the required reading and come to class. Doesn't work that way. So, so that's actually, I think, so one of the benefits we see is this kind of can expand our learning community throughout the week, or, that also leads to challenges. And I don't know if I think you addressed one of these as far as the kind of the workload or the management for students as well as faculty. How do you manage that if class is like always available online?
I teach with social media, and one of the things that I delivered a webinar a couple of days ago to my colleagues at the faculty about the whole idea about using social media, about opening your classroom and training your students to understand that what we do in our classroom is actually starting a discussion. But we can't cover everything in our classes, and lifelong learning is where we need to train them to do, and they have to continue on, and they have to be autonomous, and they have to take control over their learning experience, and etc. So being able to really be responsible about their learning and not be dependent on the professors and whatever they're giving them. I've been teaching with the problem-based learning approach, where you limit your content, right? And it's really putting them in a situation where they have to go and find, the content and define the resources and think about them in a critical way, and to help them find the solution. So really giving them this control. And then when I think about the HyFlex, I think one of the competencies, and I ask you this question, and I would really like to have your experience and your input on that. I feel that with the HyFlex, the students are pushed to be, again, in control and have the responsibility of their own learning experience, which is a very, I think, pertinent competency that we're helping them develop for this lifelong learning, where it's not because now we have a classroom every week and this is the things that you have to read and you have to be in class and we're here, we give you whatever, and then go do your assignments and love. They're actually choosing when to be and where to be and whether they're doing this asynchronously or not, and when they're interacting and when they're not. So all this control is actually good training, I think.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. I mean, we started calling this on our campus. We started calling it a student-directed hybrid a couple of years ago as another way of phrasing it, especially when we were explaining it to people, to help them get a sense of, well, what are we really talking about? It's a hybrid course, but students are controlling what's online and what's face-to-face in those cases, at least how they're participating. The faculty will decide, the specific activities. But the fact that whole idea of giving that control over to students, I think is a very important one, especially in light of the way our workplaces have been changing as well. Most work, a lot of work is remote. A lot of teams are remote, but those often, kind of like remote operational teams, even when they're co-located sometimes, because they're using all the technologies to kind of connect folks. So I think that becomes a real important skill set for them to have, and certainly it does. Part of the challenge is. A lot of teachers have a perspective where they take responsibility for their students' learning. If my students aren't learning, it's on me. And I've been a teacher for a long time, over 20 years, and that hasn't been my perspective. My perspective has been my job is to basically to facilitate their learning, to give them every possible opportunity to learn. But learning is on them. If they're not learning and they're trying, then I feel like more of a responsibility. How can I help them get this differently? But when I would have students who are clearly not really putting any effort in and not learning. It's like, okay, you're making choices here, and as long as as long as I make it clear to you how your behavior or how your choices are affecting your learning, you get to make that choice. So with the HyFlex, since I teach almost all grad students, so it's pretty easy for me to give them that control and realize, hey, look, you're a grad student, you're an adult, you know how to learn because you wouldn't be here if you didn't. If you're making choices not to participate in some way, well, that'll obviously impact your learning and it will impact your grade. Undergraduate students, I think we have to treat in the same way, but they might need more support to kind of move into this whole mindset, because I tell you, they're pretty used to tell me what to do, when to do it, and the bare minimum. What do I have to do? And if you're not going to give me points for something, I'm not doing it, right? Because I've got other things to do that I'm more invested in. So I think part of the challenge is to get students used to this. When I would have students, even at our university today, oftentimes students will come to class and they're not sure what HyFlex really is, even though there's some language or some information on websites and things like that, but they don't know what it is because they haven't experienced it. Once they figure out what it is, then they can make better choices about coming to classes and not coming to class and some of that. When I teach instructional technology students in grad courses, I would get them in one of their first courses in the curriculum, and I would always force them to do it fully online for at least 1 week, so they would see what that was like, because some of them had no online learning experience at all. And so I wanted two things. I want you to know what it's like to be an online student, so that you can either make that choice to be online without being afraid of not knowing what it's about, and two, when you have colleagues who are online students and you're in the classroom, you understand what it's like to be an online student, and you're more likely to actually engage with them in the online environment, discussion forums, etc., throughout a week, so that they're not kind of left out there on an island, which can happen.
100%. This is one of the things that I was pushing again in my first class in a HyFlex model, is to make sure that people who were online were not left alone, and especially those who are in asynchronous mode. Right. So for the project, I made sure that in each group I had from the three. Mm-hmm. So they were really interacting, and everyone felt that they belonged to the experience, like to the classroom. Yeah. Because if I left the asynchronous alone and they didn't have access to whatever was happening and all that, because people build relationship in the class, and it's a bit different. So I made sure to include them, to avoid this isolation thing or missing stuff or simply ignoring or leaving things to the last minute, so they were engaged in that. I think it was a good experience for all of them. I also teach graduate classes. So the challenge is when we talk to my groups are between 20 and 30, and which was easy for me to facilitate the discussions online and offline, and I'm on social media. So again, all the interactions were happening very easily for me because I'm used to do that. But when I speak about HyFlex Model or Formation Comodal with colleagues who are in the undergrad and they have hundreds of students,
right?
They say, how can I support all these students?
Right. Yeah. So when I get asked that question too quite a bit, and so what I usually tell them is really two or three things. One of them is, if they're already teaching several hundred students in the classroom, like a lecture hall, right? Mm-hmm. And they have a pedagogy that they've accepted in that program. It may not be the best, but they've accepted it. So I tell them, look, that ought to be your floor baseline. You have to at least be able to do that. And then it's easy to do even just a little bit more to make that a little interactive, because the problem with most lecture hall classes is there's no interaction. Now there can be separate sections, like a question, or like a homework section or something like that, but that's set up differently. But that would be a smaller group anyway. And so then we talk a little bit about, well, how do we allow for engagement and interaction, that doesn't create an extensive amount of workload for a faculty or facilitator. And so the standard model of online discussions would require facilitation like a 1 to 20 kind of arrangement. So do you have a bunch of TAs, or are you going to spend 10 times as much time as you normally would with that? Most people, the answer is no. They might have TAs, and if they have TAs, they got that. So the other things we start talking about, well, how about students themselves? Can students kind of self-facilitate, right? So I know faculty who do, one of the assignments in the class is that students take on facilitation for a group of about 20 to 25 students for 1 week of the discussions in the class. And so they break them up. And so out of 100 students, maybe, or 150 students, there might be 4 or 5 student facilitators. And then the faculty's job really is to kind of prepare those facilitators to take on that job. And most students can do that reasonably well, and some of them might be able to do it more than once if they want to. So there's that kind of model where you have break them into smaller groups and have do more peer facilitation to add on to that. Or there are I also tell them that, well, maybe what you can do is also find out from your students how they like to communicate. How do they share their ideas with each other? Because they could be using systems and media that you would probably know the names of, right? These big social media companies, but you may not touch it all. In which case, you can't be the expert in that, but let them be the expert in that. Let them set something out and maybe invite you into a conversation along that. So there's a lot of different ways to be creative around that. But yeah, you're right. The standard discussion board model, admittedly, you can't just do a standard topical discussion with the teacher expected to reply to everybody's post along the line.
And having the lecture or whatever is going in class just recorded and people online watching as a movie thing without interacting, it's not the purpose of the whole commodity.
It's the weakest pedagogy we have, and yet almost every university, that's especially large university, has some classes that operate that way, and the university says it's okay because they let it go on term after term after term. So when I talk to faculty and administrative groups, I have to be careful about taking kind of a hard line of educational quality. From my perspective as an educational psychologist and instructional designer, there are certain things that I would say, ideally, we need to be here, and yet, but looking at the practicality, we're starting over here. Right? And so like this spring, what was baseline? Baseline was your students are interacting with you in a live session around the content. And so that's what we saw. Baseline. Is it acceptable? Well, probably barely, but it's not going to attract anybody. There's no good value there other than just, reading the textbook, or watching a pre-recorded video. And so can students learn that way? Yeah, a lot of students can learn that way. Is it rich learning? No. Is it enjoyable learning? Probably not. So what we need to do then is bring you as the faculty member back into that conversation and let you be who you are, because that's what university faculty are all about. Their research, their background, their experiences, bringing those into the classroom discussions with their students. That's what students pay for. They may not realize it. And so when I talk to faculty, even around lecture capture, they would be afraid to be lecture captured because if we let you lecture capture my videos, then what do you need me for? And I'll tell them, look, if all we need is your video of you talking, we don't even need you for that. We can get, the MIT professor or someone else, a MOOC video. What we need you is for interacting with your students, right? Engaging with them, discussing with them, mentoring them.
Absolutely. I introduced in my webinar the TikTok. I don't know if you know the TikTok.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated. I can't pronounce the word. Anyway, so I'm really impressed by the creativity that's happening there and how we can actually take these 15 seconds to 1 minute videos and create something that could be a starter for a discussion or, putting people and students in a position where they have to think about a problem or something. But I was sharing this with my colleagues that we don't have to have this high production of videos and stuff like that super developed. We can work with whatever we have and really think about all these interaction and interactivity that we have with our students, because as you said, the content they can find anywhere. And this is something that I really believe in. My students, anything that I'm teaching them as content, they can Google it, they can go read it on their own.
Right.
But it's really what we're doing with that and how we're pushing them. So, and this is very challenging when you have to design these interaction, these, in 3 different with 3 different data through 3 different modes.
One of the things I've started doing actually is I used to separate the asynchronous discussion requirement from the in-class discussion requirement, and so that if you were in class and we talked about things, you did not have to be part of the asynchronous discussion. You had access, you were invited, you were encouraged, but there was no requirement. Mm-hmm. What I've done in the last, actually now that I'm teaching again, is I require all the students to be part of the asynchronous discussion, whether they're in class or not. And so what I do, so what I will often do also is trim down the time in class to give them some time back so that they don't feel like they're being asked to do a lot more than the other students used to be. I also do that because my classes, graduate courses, for us meet once a week, so it's 2 hours and 45 minutes, and that's a really long time to be in class, even for them, but for me especially. And so what I'll say, look, after like 2 hours, we're kind of done with class. We've talked about the content. We've had actually interactive discussions, but now we're going to do a focused, topical discussion throughout the week. Give you some time to think more about the content, and then reply or fit into some whatever we're doing, debates or role plays or just a kind of a topical conversation. And then I get everybody discussing in the same format, in the same forum. And that seems to really work a lot better overall. And students, because I'm giving them a little time back from the classroom, they've never complained about having to do online discussions. And so I find that that's been a really good thing as far as getting them together. The other thing I do these reflection forums. And so everybody has to do that. It's the same medium. It's all online. It's all essentially asynchronous. And yet, so they're all in that. That's another shared experience that they have. And we know the shared experiences are what form community. So that helps as well. And like you said, where you put together people from different modalities on project teams, I encourage that as well. That seems to be pretty effective as well. And when I have the live students in the classroom, I always make sure that some of them are online also, so they can basically be my facilitators in the room. I never have to deal with no facilitators because I always have at least 3 or 4, even when there's only 6 people in class. They want to be online anyway.
Yeah, and it's amazing how people who were in class, they felt responsible for those who were online. Yeah. They wanted to make sure to include them. So as you were saying, they were part of making sure that the experience was working for everyone. And even for the asynchronous, because we had in the forum and asynchronous students were able to ask questions, these guys were the first to answer them. And it was very interesting to have this community built between these 3 modalities. And people, at some point, I didn't have to really interact or add anything except like I agree or just encourage the discussion. Yeah. But it was really happening between them. And I think this is really another positive approach, because in real life, when you're in a workplace, this is how people are interacting. People are coming from, it's the workplace, the workforce is becoming global, and people are working synchronously, asynchronously, in office, outside of the office. And so it's really, again, preparing them for what's out there in a very, I think in a safe space. Right. Because it's still within, like, they're still learning and they have the learning curve, and we're guiding them through this process.
When you talk about equity among students, what do you mean by that?
The different experiences that we're creating, the learning experience that we're creating for our students, and access to the technology and the access to, and even the skills that they develop, because you have some, the whole myth about digital natives and digital movement, which is simply a myth, right? So many professors expect that the students, because they are digital natives, that they can actually use the technology to learn.
So talk about exposing a myth this spring, right? Everybody has ubiquitous access to high quality bandwidth, and they can use these tools just like everybody else. Well, no, not really. So, well, that's interesting. When we talk about this, I really try to focus on equivalent outcomes. So the learning, you're going to be able to meet these outcomes no matter which path you're choosing, or whatever combination of paths. But I also talk about the fact that everybody is actually going to learn something a little differently, because it's a human process, right? Your understanding, even of what we're having in this discussion right now, is different than mine. And someone else who's listening to this later will come away with a different understanding, right? So we have to make sure that we appreciate the fact that there is a lot of individuality in learning, and yet we have these high-level student learning outcomes or objectives that our job is to help people to reach, right? And so that's what I focus on. And then the other part of this is acknowledging that the experience as a fully online student, especially asynchronous, will be different than that of a online synchronous student, or especially someone in the classroom. Just think of the participation in discussions, the discussion format in a classroom with that, the dynamic, short phrases, spur of the moment thoughts kinds of things, the immediate reaction to what someone else has just said. That kind of experience in discussion is very different. It's a very different communication, right? And social engagement process than it is an online discussion, where you see things, you have a chance to read and compose language that represents you well. It can be much more of a written format. Now, social medias would be different probably than that. So that can be a very different experience. And so one way to get more equitable experience in the discussion is to put everybody in the online discussion in particular. Mm-hmm. Without giving up the dynamic nature of the classroom, because that's important too. And yet making sure everybody's part of that maybe more thoughtful, discussion experience that maybe helps them learn a little bit more and think about what they're learning, because they have more time to kind of process that. So that's one way to bring about more equity, not just equivalent learning outcomes, but more equity in the experience, is by giving them more common experiences, right? If you've got your synchronous online students engaged with your in-class students, when I do breakouts in class, for example, if I've got online students live, I'll try to get them to be part of the same groups, as long as we can make that work with the noise, and we've got people in the classroom online as well. That can work really well, and that then tends to give them a more equitable experience, even if they were in their own group. And sometimes I'd put all of the online students in their own group, for management purposes, or because maybe they're self-choosing that group too. They get a good discussion environment, even though it's different than in the classroom.
And we have also the evaluations, where we also have to make sure that, so it's another challenge.
Yeah, like assessing learning, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. In my classes, I've never had a problem with that, because I always do projects, papers. I have a class, an instructional design class. They build an instructional design plan for a course, and so the whole class, you're building this along the way, and everybody's doing the same project. They're giving people peer feedback. They turn it in exactly the same. They do presentations at the end, the whole works. And so that's never been a problem. But I know a lot of people. I was just talking to a group today, and they're asking about, well, how about these high stakes assessments, these the final exams and things like that? What do we do about that? And usually what I tell them is, if you can't shift your assessment strategy away from that, all right, I get it, because I understand there are lots of reasons why we have these high stakes exams. You might think about giving that everybody in the same environment, right, for equity, essentially. Because if you've got people in a classroom where teachers walking around the hall, right through the chairs or whatever, that's a different experience than if you're online. Even if you have, this kind of fake proctor who's watching you, that itself is a different experience than that. And so what I would tell them is that my recommendation is one of two things. Either bring everybody in. I wouldn't do that myself, but I've seen other faculty do that well. And if they have regional students, and they can, and it makes, it's practical for the students, they can plan their schedule and come in for a final exam and be proctored the same way, or do it all online in the online environment and use a consistent approach there.
But then students who choose to be in class, and they have a bit of challenge of, for them being challenging, then where this, they will be suffering from actually moving everyone online, like the test. You know what I mean? Like, there will be a disadvantage because they choose to be in class for a certain reason, and technology will be one of them. Yeah.
No, you're right. That's a great point. I don't think there's not a single best answer here. There's a range of approaches and each one has some advantages and disadvantages. And so I think part of the challenge and the skill of being a good teacher with support from design staff is making the choice that's best for your students, and then also thinking, well, I'm going to make this choice, but guess what? These 5 students cannot come into campus to do this. Maybe they're prevented because of some, a physical reason, or maybe they actually are distant students and they just can't come here. So what do we do for that? And so we always have to have some alternative. Or we have students maybe who are in class and they have, maybe they have an accommodation, a disability accommodation that requires them to be there, or to have a separate approach towards their exams, the timing or whatever it happens to be. Those have to be, you have to be able to accommodate that also. So there really is no one size that fits everyone. It's what makes the most sense, and then how do we work around the edges to, meet the other needs of other people. It's always got some messiness in there, kind of managing that. The edges are, that's where I think that's part of the interesting and creative part of being a teacher, but it's also some of the most challenging things.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to also discuss with you the competencies that teachers, professors need to have, because this is another thing. You know that some professors are excellent when they're offline, some others they teach online.
Right.
But mixing these require a different set of skills,
right.
And even being flexible, right, to the different needs of the students. It's something that is obvious, or that professors will be. It's not because they are not willing, but simply because they don't know maybe how to do it, or they are.
Well, and some may not be willing to,
or some they are resistant to do that.
Yeah, I think that that's a real challenge in the even now these days in our professoriate, is we still have people who believe differently. As in, this is the way I teach, and if they're taking my class, I've heard this in my own university not that long ago. If they can't learn this way, then they need to take another class, another section. Go take it from this instructor over there. They teach it differently. I understand that, but that really can't be an acceptable answer. Now, for our senior faculty, it has to be an acceptable answer, because we really can't do much, if anything, about that. And yet, that could be something that is it's a long, kind of a longer change as we hire differently, as students go through graduate programs differently. They kind of build these competencies in there, the expectation that there's variety, there's flexibility, there's agility, and we have to be responsive to the the emergence of whatever the situation is. That's, I think, a change that takes a while. Now, there are a lot of faculty who could do that way, but maybe have never just been challenged to teach that way, or have been, haven't done that because they haven't actually taken the time to notice that there's a need there. And that's, I think, where faculty development really can have a power, because it's probably the 40 to 60% of the faculty that could do a lot better, but just have never been challenged to do so. So I think we look for those opportunities. Yeah. I mean, we see that in a lot of different areas, not just the pedagogy approach, but, the way we treat students, all those kinds of things.
Exactly. And the other thing that I also was thinking about is, if you can talk about equity when it comes to professors and what we're asking them to do, because again, like when I think about myself, I've been teaching online, I've been using social media. For me, it's something that I can do. It's something that will not take more time or more effort from me to actually do. But professors who never taught online, who never used the technology, who never used social media or any other kind of platform, there were the workload. It's not simply once the experience is designed and the facilitation of it's actually getting there.
Yeah.
It will be, for me, like, for example, it will be unfair to ask me or to pay me the same salary as somebody who will have to work double and triple in order for them to reach wherever they have to reach, because they will be working much more and harder than myself, because I already developed these skills that are what I mean? Like, so yes. I've sometimes I feel that is it is it fair to ask these professors, like, it's important, right? This is part of the transformation and adaptation to what's coming and really answering to the needs of the students. But at the same time, yes, we have the support that we're giving them, but we need to acknowledge the fact that it is a challenge for many, other than the resistance, because some of the resistance comes from fear, other resistance because they are really, this is how I teach, some other resistance. So there are so many different reasons why they say no. And one of the reasons could be simply because it's really a very hard job for them. Like, it's not easy.
Oh, agreed. That's a great point. One of the things that comes to mind is the need for us to focus on the outcomes. So without getting bogged down into the details on how someone actually does something, because we'll always have that sense of variety among, even to reply to an email from your department chair. It might take me 3 seconds because I know exactly what I'm going to say. I've said it before and boom, I can just pop it out. Someone else might take hours or even days to compose that similar response email because it has to say exactly the same thing. Maybe their language skills are differently and they're not quite sure, so they want someone else to read it. Or they could be more in tune with the interpersonal aspects of what they're saying and more concerned about that. So almost everything we do has that variety. So for faculty, I think that it's really important to focus on workflow and not so much workload, which means this is where I talk about baselines. We have to have baseline expectations where we have reasonable expectations that you can do this without more than maybe 10% extra effort, right? Maybe there's more work, especially getting started learning how to do that, but then you'll get efficiencies over time. And so your effort might go up a certain amount, but maybe then it starts decaying back to where it was, like an asymptote there, right? And that, for online teaching or HyFlex teaching, that isn't the gold standard. I think a lot of faculty can get there because the baseline should be acceptable, right? Baseline acceptable. And then, okay, maybe you try one thing or maybe you try two things. One of the things I recognized a few years after I started talking about this is when I showed off my course to my faculty at the university, I was scaring a lot of them away. Right, because I had built something over 3 years, and every term I would try something a little differently, and then I would add in this, and now I'm doing, a live recording in the classroom, and they were like, "Dude, there's no way I'm going to do that. I could never do that." And so I had to really kind of scale back and say, "Well, here's how I actually got started." So I showed them the first version, which had an audio file from the classroom. It caught on a little DVR recorder, a little MP3 file, and an asynchronous discussion board, and then posted, lecture slides and things like that. Baseline, it got the information, allowed students online to hear what went on in the classroom, and gave them a space for discussion. And so that was a lot more accessible to them. And then the ones who would start with something simple like that, then they would find their own ways to accelerate the next term, and the next term, and the next term. And so as an administrator and a peer faculty member, we have to be willing to give them the time to kind of get on that on-ramp with us rather than expecting, okay, you're going to go from here up to here. So that's one of the big challenges. The other thing that is important, I think, to realize, and this is an interesting thing for a lot of faculty, is that our students go through exactly the same thing, right? Where we assume, hey, I'm going to give you a reading assignment. It should take you, 30 minutes. Well, guess what? Some of your students are going to spend 5 or 10 minutes, and they're going to get just as much as some student who spends 3 or 4 hours on that because of the variety of the ways they learn, they read, language skills, all that stuff. And so we should be really, cognizant of what we're requiring our students to do and looking at what's it doing to them, to their lives. I have a grad student right now who's not a native of the United States and has had challenges with participating in online discussions. I think it's not because their spoken language is at deficit. I think it's the written language that challenges her. And so she's very reluctant to post anything because she thinks, if it's got some punctuation mistakes or some language mistakes, that's hard for her to accept. So my challenge actually as a mentor to her is to help her get beyond that. Say, well, your ideas are more important. Well, we can work on the language over time, but we need your ideas as part of this conversation for you to get the most you can out of this course. So same thing for the students. It's going to take students more time. I think that's one of the reasons why some students just will always want to come to class. they may not do it for any learning or any learning reason at all. Like, I learn better in class. Now, you guess what? I don't want to have to read all that stuff and post all that stuff to the forums. And so I'm just going to come to class. I show up, I answer a couple of questions. I look alert, right? I don't have to be thinking about that content. So yeah, there's so much variety. So we should be aware of that when we're designing, of course. And one of the things one of my challenges when I build the online part of my course is I put so much stuff up there because there's so many resources and there are a lot of great ideas, and so I want to give them exposure to a lot of things. But I found even the last year or so, I found even a more important need to structure it and communicate in ways that don't let them feel like I'm pushing them towards more and more and more. It's like, here's what we're doing, and here's what we really have to do. Now, if you want to go more, here's some other things you can do. And then part of their learning is figuring out how to manage that extra stuff, just like they will in life, right?
You know what I did in my class? I gave them also, and I vary videos, and it's always like the open access stuff. But instead of me telling them, like, I think it's the same approach, but in a different, instead of telling them, if you want to have access to more, this is what you can do. I opened like a kind of a forum, and I called it could be interesting. And I asked them to, whatever they can find more, to actually bring it to the class and discuss that. And it was part of their participation. And I talk a lot about, co-constructing knowledge together and all the community that we're building and etc. and the importance of their voice and the importance of the fact that I developed some expertise, right? But I will never know everything that's happening out there. And I will be super appreciative for everything they can bring to our classroom because I know as much, right? But the word is, so the fact that they are going out there, looking at what's happening, filtering and bringing back to the conversation something that could be interesting, and then we can build on that, push them, without me asking them to read more, it pushed them to actually be engaged and be, again, in control of their...
No, I agree. I was just talking earlier today with some faculty about how to make discussion forums more interesting to students, just to kind of get them to engage. And one of the things I suggested was that they take certain topics in their class and either encourage or require the students to come up with the discussion topics. All right, so everyone in the class, or maybe there's a group of three every week. Okay, the three of you, your job is to come up with the topic that we're going to discuss, right? And so they come up, they work with a faculty member to make sure it's okay and it's on, kind of along the right lines, but let them be as creative as possible. And then, they're much more likely to be encouraging their peers, their network of peers, to be in the discussion. And there's more likelihood that they'll have a richer discussion, because students don't want to disappoint their friends or their colleagues, and they want other people to be discussing in their forums.
Exactly.
Yeah. So to give more of that control over to the students, you're not giving them control over really what you're learning, right? But you're giving them control over process. And you're giving them more control over the details so that it's more innately interesting to them because they're coming up with it. And you would assume that they would do something that was interesting.
They will be more engaged because they are the one leading the discussion and the one who are deciding. So instead of having something that is imposed upon them, so it's really them. So they have the sense of control in a way.
Yeah.
That is engaging and motivating, I think, to the students.
Yeah.
The other thing that also is being part of our discussion, and I'm just going back to the COVID and all the crisis that is happening, the risk of isolation, the more and more having this isolation, especially for undergrad, first-year students who are starting their experience, and they, as you said at the beginning, they're looking for this experience on campus, and now they're alone. Right?
Yep.
So what are the strategies that you are using or that you're planning for that could be addressing this isolation thing?
Well, so we want them to be connected to the university and to our graduate programs or programs in general, and to the faculty and to the other students. And so one of the things I make sure is that they're doing some sort of a group project It may not be a classic group project where they're building one thing, but they're in some sort of a project team, and maybe they're doing individual projects, but they've kind of got this working cohort together so that nobody is left in isolation for the major work of the course. That's one of the strategies that I typically do use, so that and those students could be online, they could be face-to-face, they could be in the classroom. If they're all online, of course, then they're all online. But we want to make sure they're feeling connected to that. Now, the other thing I did this last term, even while we were kind of away from campus, I had a couple of student projects, and I set them up with clients, basically project owners who were staff members at the university, and so their projects were directly contributing towards the university getting better. And it was usability testing for digital products, and so one was looking at a particular website, one was looking at information architecture and things like that for two different units in the university. So now that gave those students connections to staff at the university and the feeling that they're contributing towards the improvement of the experience for all students. So that's another way of getting them connected, is to give them things to do that are directly valuable to the institution, or the department, college, program, those kinds of things. And that just naturally lends them to be more committed, because now they feel like they're more part of the bigger, the family. The relationship is stronger that way.
Yeah.
So you got to give them things to do, I think, that are meaningful. That seems to be our student affairs folks. They're trying to think of all these ways to do this, like extracurricular.
Yeah.
All that's important too, right?
Yeah.
But so they'll do their job too, hopefully. And I imagine our athletics departments are trying to figure out what to do as well, as far as engaging students, especially their student athletes. How do they keep their student athletes hanging around, or rather than transferring to a class, a college that's actually on campus and they can do their sport. So the challenge goes across the board. But I would say that would probably be the one thing I would kind of defer. Do you have great ideas?
We're thinking about, again, another thing that we're challenged with is, other than the project in class, because many of the students talk about, especially in these cases when we force them or we push them to work in groups, managing the time is also a big challenge for them, especially when they have their kids at home, and being also asking them also to find ways or time to meet with other team members. So, this is part of the things that we will be doing. But we're thinking also about how to help them socialize or put them in a challenge some way, like this part, like not only within our classroom or part of our classes, to start with some activities where they're together, maybe doing a challenge. Like, for example, the TikTok challenge, where they have this dance challenge, or the plank challenge, or some kind of a challenge that could be relevant to whatever we're doing, but that would actually make them interact with each other and start, break the ice and see each other in a different way, not only my peer in my class with whom I need to just meet once a week and do whatever I need to do, but it's actually another human being who's living and going through the same experience that I am, and also maybe suffering from this isolation or whatever. So we're thinking about all these different strategies that now it's the time to really employ whatever we have, all these different tools, to make sure that we're helping our students, because again, they're looking for this experience, this connection with their peers and with the campus, and we have only the choice to do it online. So we have to find ways that.
That's a good point. And there's a university need for that, right? And that's where my student affairs folks, I think, would be engaged. But there's a classroom need for that as well, because then you basically you end up forming a stronger community, then that naturally would support your learning outcome goals as well. And I used to tell myself, I have to take time to, in the first couple of class sessions, to do some icebreakers and to get them talking to each other, not necessarily about the content. So they learn who each other are, and they learn who I am, and I learn who they are. And that experience, even though it might take a couple of hours of class time, paid big dividends in the long run in their ability to engage and the richness of the learning. You did raise another question about
AI.
the use of AI thing. Yeah. And I tell you, I used to teach high school math and science a long time ago, over 20 years ago, and wish I had tools like we had today. But even when I was back in those days, we were starting to play around with like simulations, like physics simulations, to replace some of the things we did in the lab, because the labs were so frustrating. I understood what was supposed to happen, but I also had to set everything up and use this old equipment that just didn't work very well. And so students, of course, would come out with these strange graphs and numbers like, well, I think there's a law here, a relationship. But in the simulation, you could run it over and over and over again and change various factors. And so it became such a cool learning tool. So this last spring, I have 3 of my kids are living at home, and they're all college students, community college students. And one of them was in a calculus and a physics course. And both of those courses were using the My Pearson lab or something like that, where they were doing homework and tests online. And I was really amazed at how they designed those homework assignments so that if you got it wrong, you'd get you could get a level of support that you felt you needed, and then you would have another chance to do it. And so it really became, even the quizzes became learning activities, because they could do them. I think they got like 5 or 6 different chances to do them. And the nice thing about that faculty was, if they had a question on a quiz question and they couldn't get it, or a homework, maybe it was more for homework, but then my daughter would send an email out and she'd get replies from her faculty, who would actually then take the time to video a little explanation on a tablet and send it back. Very cool. But the AI part of that allowed her to get a lot more support in her learning process than she would have gotten in any face-to-face classroom, unless it was like just her with a tutor, right? Kind of the intelligent tutoring system idea. I think that's really powerful. My challenge with it a little bit is the cost, but I can understand why the cost is $100 or $200, but for a lot of our students, that's a hard thing. So if the university can provide or support students in getting that access to that, I think those are really powerful tools that can really support more effective learning, especially for online students, but also for our regular students. If students can use those packages, as in preparation, then the classroom can be a very different place.
Because when I think about this question, it was really about how again, the challenge that professors or faculty members talk about when they talk about HyFlex is the amount and the workload and the amount of work that they have to do in order to design, and then to facilitate, and then to do all the support. So if you have this first level of interactions where you have the main questions answered by a tutor, intelligent chatbot, or you have these admin thing, or even to personalize, you have all this data analytics and you can personalize your learning, the design of your learning experiences, then I think maybe it would encourage them to engage in this experience, because we're taking away some load and we're asking them to reflect on something that is much more interesting and more engaging for our students. So this is why I was asking you about what do you think about whether this would actually help the HyFlex model to be pushed into and more accepted and having less resistance.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, the resistance comes from the online teaching component of it, because we're dealing almost exclusively with faculty who are experienced teaching in the classroom and are comfortable in that format. Almost all of them are that way, or they get there within a couple of years, or they leave the profession, or they go into more of a research mode. So it's really, the challenge really is in the online area, and it's not really around the content. It's not really around the assessment either. It's really in the engagement. And so if we can solve that, and using more AI kind of resources, and that could be engaging with the content, it could be engaging with peers. I was just trying to remember, I know they have these, bots in forums. I don't know if any of those have ever been used in an educational capacity. Other than maybe a experimental situation. But like for a large class, if you had a bot out there that could actually engage in some sort of facilitation of a discussion forum, that might be the kind of tool that could help.
Because it was, I remember I was teaching this to my students at some point. I forgot the name of the professor who used it, or the university, where he introduced the chatbot, but he didn't tell the students that it was a chatbot. And the whole year, the students were interacting with the chatbot and thinking that it was another teaching assistant. And then at the end, he revealed the thing, but it was a very interesting experience. And the year after, he introduced 2 chatbots and teaching assistants, and he informed the students that you will have teaching assistants and chatbots, and you have to know which is which, right?
Yeah.
A huge percentage of the students thought that the chatbot was a human and the human was a chatbot. I forgot the name of the university and the professor.
Yeah, I remember hearing something about that. It may have been at a conference. I'm going to look that up and kind of see where that is, because I think that could be really interesting. I mean, it would be very interesting. I'm wondering how well that would go across with faculty as well. I mean, I'm just thinking San Francisco State, our faculty are very, we're very humanistics. We're equity and social justice, and there are reasons why we have only a small handful of only online programs. Lots of courses, no programs. So that would be very interesting. I'm going to take a look at that. I like that. That's a great idea. In fact, I'd love to think about. I mean, you should think about too if there's something that you want to contribute to the HyFlex, the book. It's an open access book, and it's just the basic stuff that I was able to pull together and get up online last October. Really, the timing on that was perfect. But there's a lot else that could be written about this as we share our experiences and even some of these more conceptual content areas as well. That's another possibility. So that would be fine. Yeah, and it would really be good to have a good idea. Understand what you guys are doing there for the fall and for the spring. I imagine there'll be a lot more people talking about this throughout the year. The level of interest in the whole concept is just this is the opportunity to this is the bridge to mainstream. I think the on ramp to mainstream in higher education in particular.